The snow fell in silence over the barbed wire, each flake dissolving against the frozen mud as if the earth itself refused to hold anything pure. Marlena's hands trembled as she gripped the metal basin, her knuckles white against the rust-stained rim. The water inside had frozen overnight, a thin sheet of ice that reflected her face in fragments. One eye, half a mouth, a scar that ran from her temple to her jaw. She didn't recognize herself anymore. 23 years old, though she felt ancient, as if centuries had passed since the soldiers came to her village in Poland and took her away in a truck with 11 other women. All of them promised work in a factory. All of them lied to. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The building they called Block 7 stood at the edge of the camp, separated from the main compound by 2 rows of wire and a stretch of dead grass where nothing grew. It was a low structure, concrete and wood, with small windows covered in iron bars and a heavy door that locked from the outside. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of carbolic soap, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something metallic and bitter that Marlena had learned was the scent of despair. 26 women lived in Block 7. Some had been there for 3 years. Others, like Marlena, had arrived just 8 months ago, though it felt like a lifetime. She set the basin down and wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the rough fabric of her gray dress scratch against her skin. The dress was standard issue, shapeless and thin, offering no warmth against the February cold. Her feet were bare except for wooden clogs that clattered against the floor with every step, announcing her presence before she entered a room. The Germans liked that sound. It meant they could hear the women coming, could track their movements through the building like livestock. Marlena! The voice came from behind her, soft and hoarse. She turned to see Katarzyna standing in the doorway of the washing room, her face gaunt and pale, her dark hair hanging in limp strands around her shoulders. Katarzyna was older, maybe 35, though the camp had aged her beyond recognition. She had been a teacher before the war. She once told Marlena during one of their rare conversations in the night when the guards weren't listening. She had taught children to read in a small schoolhouse in Krakow, had loved poetry and music and the smell of chalk dust on her fingers. "They're calling for you," Katarzyna said quietly, her eyes not meeting Marlena's. "Officer Weber. He's waiting in room 3. Marlena felt her stomach tighten, a familiar nausea rising in her throat. Room 3 was at the end of the corridor, the one with the green door and the window that looked out onto the electrified fence. Weber was a regular visitor, a man in his 40s with thinning blonde hair and a scar across his left cheek from some battle he'd fought years ago. He never spoke much, just grunted and breathed heavily, his hands rough and impatient. Marlena had learned to empty her mind during those encounters, to float somewhere above her body and think of other things. Her mother's garden in spring, the way the apple blossoms would fall like snow, the sound of her younger brother's laughter when he chased the chickens across the yard. "How long has he been waiting?" Marlena asked, though it didn't really matter. Time in Block 7 moved differently than in the outside world. Minutes stretched into hours, days blurred together, and the only markers were the visits, the meals, the occasional sound of gunfire from the main camp when someone tried to escape or was executed for disobedience. 10 minutes, Katarzyna said. She reached out and touched Marlena's arm, a brief gesture of solidarity. "Be careful. He's in a mood today. I heard him shouting at Greta earlier." Marlena nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Greta was a German woman, one of the 2 who worked in Block 7 not as prisoners but as staff, managing the schedules and keeping order under the supervision of Frau Schaefer, the matronly woman with iron-gray hair who ran the brothel like a strict boarding school. Greta was young, maybe 19, with round cheeks and nervous eyes that darted away whenever she had to deliver bad news. She wasn't cruel, not like some of the guards, but she wasn't kind either. She was trapped in her own way, Marlena had come to understand. Trapped by fear, by duty, by the knowledge that refusal meant punishment or worse. Marlena walked down the corridor, her clogs echoing against the wooden floorboards. The walls were painted a dull green, peeling in places to reveal the gray concrete underneath. Photographs hung at intervals, propaganda posters showing strong German soldiers and happy workers, images of the Führer with his stern expression and raised hand. Someone had scrawled a word in Polish on one of the posters, a curse that had been hastily scrubbed away but still left a faint shadow on the paper. She passed room 1, where she could hear muffled voices, a man's low rumble and a woman's high-pitched laugh that sounded forced and brittle. Room 2 was silent, the door closed, a small card hanging from the doorknob that read besetzt, occupied. She wondered who was inside, which of her fellow prisoners was enduring what she was about to endure, and felt a pang of guilt for being grateful it wasn't her turn for the worse officers, the ones who enjoyed causing pain. Room 3's green door stood slightly ajar. Marlena paused outside, taking a deep breath, steeling herself. She could smell cigarette smoke drifting through the gap, heard the creak of bed springs as Weber shifted his weight. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and sparse, a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a gray blanket, a wooden chair in the corner, a small table with a washbasin and a bar of soap. The window overlooked the fence, beyond which stretched the main camp with its rows of barracks and the tall chimney that smoked day and night, belching gray ash into the winter sky. Weber sat on the edge of the bed, his uniform jacket unbuttoned, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked up as she entered, his pale blue eyes assessing her with the same cold detachment she'd seen 100 times before. "Close the door," he said in German, his voice flat and emotionless. Marlena obeyed, turning the lock with fingers that felt numb and clumsy. She stood by the door, waiting, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Weber took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaled slowly, then stubbed it out in a tin ashtray on the table. He stood, unbuckled his belt with deliberate slowness, and gestured toward the bed. "Quickly," he said. "I don't have much time." Marlena moved mechanically, her mind already beginning to drift, to pull away from her body and retreat into that safe, distant place where she couldn't be touched. She thought of the apple blossoms, the way they smelled like honey and sunshine, the way her mother would hum old folk songs while she hung the laundry on the line. She thought of her brother, Pyotr, who would be 15 now if he was still alive, if the soldiers hadn't shot him when he tried to run during the raid on their village. Time passed. She didn't know how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Weber finished and dressed without a word, buttoned his jacket, smoothed his hair with one hand. He dropped a few coins on the table, though Marlena would never see that money. It went to Frau Schaefer, who kept meticulous records of every transaction, every visit, every mark earned by the women of Block 7. "You can go," Weber said, not looking at her. He opened the door and left, his boots heavy on the floor as he walked away. Marlena sat up slowly, her body aching, her mind numb. She washed herself at the basin, the water ice cold, scrubbing her skin until it turned red and raw. She dressed, smoothed her hair, and stepped back into the corridor. Katarzyna was waiting outside, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. She didn't say anything, just met Marlena's eyes with a look of weary understanding. They walked together back to the sleeping quarters, a long room with rows of narrow bunks stacked 3 high. Most of the women were resting or sitting in small groups, talking in low voices. Some stared at the walls with blank expressions. Others wept silently, their shoulders shaking. Marlena climbed onto her bunk, the middle tier on the left side near the window. She lay on her side, pulling the thin blanket over herself, and stared at the wall where someone had scratched a calendar into the wood with a nail. February 1945. The war was supposed to be ending soon. They heard whispers from the guards, saw the worry in Frau Schaefer's eyes when she thought no one was watching. The Allies were advancing, pushing into Germany from the west and the east, and the camp administrators were growing nervous, burning documents, holding hushed meetings behind closed doors. But for the women of Block 7, the war's end felt impossibly far away, like a fairy tale they'd once believed in as children but had long since outgrown. Freedom was an abstract concept, something they couldn't quite imagine anymore. What would freedom even look like? Would they be able to return to their villages, to their families? Would anyone even want them back, knowing what had been done to them, what they had been forced to become? Marlena closed her eyes and tried to sleep, But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself thinking about the day she'd been taken, replaying it over and over like a film reel stuck on repeat. It had been a Sunday morning in June, the church bells ringing across the valley, the smell of fresh bread wafting from her mother's kitchen. She had been hanging sheets on the clothesline when the trucks arrived, 3 of them painted in dull green, filled with soldiers in gray uniforms. They had swept through the village like locusts, pulling women from their homes, ignoring the screams and protests of the men who tried to intervene. Her father had grabbed a pitchfork and rushed at the soldiers. They shot him in the chest without hesitation, his body crumpling into the dirt like a puppet with its strings cut. Her mother had screamed and screamed until one of the soldiers struck her across the face with the butt of his rifle. Marlena had been thrown into the back of a truck with 10 other women. Neighbors, friends, girls she'd grown up with. They had driven for hours, stopping only once to relieve themselves in a ditch by the side of the road, the soldiers watching with bored expressions. They had been taken to a transit camp first, a place with rows of tents and barbed wire where hundreds of women waited in limbo, not knowing where they would be sent or what would happen to them. Marlena had spent 3 weeks there, sleeping on a thin mat on the ground, eating watery soup and stale bread, listening to the other women's stories. Some had been promised jobs in factories. Others had been told they would work as domestic servants for German families. All of them had been lied to. From the transit camp, Marlena and 25 other women had been loaded onto a train, not cattle cars but actual passenger cars with seats and windows, which had given them a brief, false hope that maybe the promises were true, maybe they really would be given decent work. But when they arrived at the camp, when they saw the barbed wire and the guard towers and the smoke rising from the chimney, they understood the truth. Block 7 had been their destination. Frau Schaefer had greeted them at the entrance, her expression stern but not unkind, and explained the rules in careful German that one of the women translated into Polish. They would serve the officers and guards of the camp. They would be given food and shelter in exchange for their cooperation. Refusal would result in punishment, solitary confinement, reduced rations, or transfer to the main camp where conditions were far worse and life expectancy measured in weeks rather than months. Marlena had wanted to refuse, had wanted to spit in Frau Schaefer's face and tell her she would rather die than submit. But then she had looked at the faces of the other women, had seen the fear and resignation in their eyes, and understood that survival here meant compromise, meant doing things that would haunt her for the rest of her life if she lived that long. A sound pulled her from her memories, the heavy clang of the main door opening, followed by voices in the corridor. Marlena sat up, listening. It was unusual for visitors to come in the afternoon. Most appointments were scheduled for evening or night when the officers had finished their duties in the main camp. Everyone to the common room. Frau Schaefer's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Now, all of you. Marlena exchanged glances with Katarzyna, who had climbed down from the bunk above. Something was wrong. Frau Schaefer's voice held a note of tension they hadn't heard before, a quaver that suggested fear barely held in check. The women filed out of the sleeping quarters and gathered in the common room, a larger space with a few worn sofas, a table with mismatched chairs, and a radio that was never turned on except when Frau Schaefer wanted them to hear official announcements. 26 women stood in silence, their faces pale and drawn, waiting. Frau Schaefer stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Behind her stood 2 SS guards Marlena didn't recognize, younger men with nervous eyes who kept glancing toward the window as if expecting something. "The camp is being evacuated," Frau Schaefer said, her voice clipped and professional, though her hands trembled slightly. "Enemy forces are approaching. You will remain here in Block 7 until further instructions are given. Do not attempt to leave the building. Do not make noise. Anyone who disobeys will be shot on sight." A murmur rippled through the women, a collective intake of breath. Evacuated. Enemy forces. The words seemed impossible, too enormous to comprehend. Marlena felt her pulse quicken, a flutter of something that might have been hope but felt more like terror. "When?" Katarzyna asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "When are they coming?" Frau Schaefer's eyes hardened. "That is not your concern. Return to your quarters and wait." But no one moved. The women stood frozen, their minds racing with questions that had no answers. If the camp was being evacuated, where would the guards go? Would they take the women with them? Would they leave them here to face whatever enemy was approaching? Or would they simply eliminate them, erase the evidence of Block 7's existence before anyone could discover what had happened here? One of the young guards shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his shoulder. "You heard Frau Schaefer," he said in German, his voice cracking slightly. "Back to your quarters. Now." Slowly, reluctantly, the women began to move. Marlena returned to her bunk, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. She lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building. The creak of floorboards, the whisper of voices, the distant rumble of something that might have been thunder or might have been artillery fire. Night fell, bringing with it a strange, heavy silence. No visitors came to Block 7. No guards patrolled the corridors. The women huddled in their bunks, speaking in whispers, sharing what little information they had gleaned from overheard conversations and stolen glances at newspapers. "I heard the Americans are coming from the west," said Sophia, a Czech woman who spoke 5 languages and had worked as a translator before the war. "They've crossed the Rhine. They're moving fast." "And the Russians from the east," added Inga, one of the 2 German women in Block 7 who had been imprisoned for political crimes before being transferred here. "The camp is caught between 2 advancing armies. The guards are panicking. What will they do with us?" Marlena asked, voicing the question that haunted all of them. No one answered. There was no answer to give, only speculation and fear and the faint, desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, they might survive the next few days. Marlena woke before dawn to the sound of gunfire in the distance, a rapid staccato that made her heart leap into her throat. She lay perfectly still, listening, trying to determine how far away the shots were and which direction they were coming from. Around her, the other women stirred, their breathing quick and shallow, their eyes wide in the darkness. "It's closer than yesterday," Katarzyna whispered from the bunk above. "Much closer." The days that followed were suspended in a strange limbo, a waiting game with uncertain rules and unknown consequences. The regular schedule of Block 7 had collapsed entirely. No visitors came. Meals arrived irregularly, sometimes a bucket of thin soup and a loaf of bread for all 26 women to share, sometimes nothing for an entire day. Frau Schaefer appeared less and less frequently, her face drawn and haggard, her iron-gray hair escaping from its usual tight bun. The guards who remained grew increasingly agitated, snapping at the women for minor infractions, their hands always on their weapons. Marlena found herself thinking constantly about her life before, about the person she had been in that village in Poland that now seemed to exist in another universe entirely. She had been the second of 4 children, born to a farming family that scratched out a modest living from 20 acres of rocky soil and a small apple orchard. Her father had been a quiet man, thoughtful and kind, who loved to whittle figures from wood in the evenings, horses and birds and little dolls that he would give to Marlena and her younger sister, Sophia. Her mother had been the stronger presence, the one who ran the household with efficient determination, who could butcher a chicken and bake bread and mend clothes and tend to sick animals all in the same day without complaint. She had taught Marlena to read using an old primer that had belonged to her own mother, tracing the letters with her finger and sounding out words by candlelight. Reading had opened up whole worlds to Marlena, had given her dreams of something beyond the village, beyond the endless cycle of planting and harvest and winter survival. She had wanted to be a nurse. Before the war, she had talked to Father Kowalski about the possibility of going to Lodz to attend a nursing school there. He had encouraged her, had even offered to write a letter of recommendation. But then the war had come, first the Germans and then the chaos, and all those dreams had evaporated like morning mist. In Block 7, Marlena had tried to hold onto pieces of herself, small rituals and habits that reminded her she was still human, still the girl who had once dreamed of helping others. She had befriended Katarzyna first, drawn to the older woman's quiet dignity and the way she refused to let her spirit be completely crushed despite everything they endured. Katarzyna told stories in the night, whispered tales of Polish history, and folklore that transported them briefly away from the concrete walls and iron bars. There was also Nina, a Ukrainian woman barely 20 years old with blonde hair that she kept tied back in a braid and large blue eyes that held depths of sorrow no one so young should carry. Nina rarely spoke, seemed to exist in a fog of detachment that Marlena recognized as a survival mechanism. But sometimes, late at night, Nina would reach out and take Marlena's hand, squeezing it tightly as if trying to anchor herself to something real. And there was Hannah, a fiery redhead from Warsaw who had been a cabaret singer before the war, who sometimes hummed old jazz standards under her breath, and who had once smuggled a comb into Block 7 by hiding it in her undergarments. She had shared that comb with all the women, taking turns trying to work through the tangles in their hair, and for a brief moment they had felt almost human again, almost like regular women preparing for an ordinary day. Marlena had established small routines that gave structure to the chaos. Every morning, she would splash cold water on her face and neck, counting to 20 as she scrubbed, the cold shocking her into alertness. She would braid her dark hair tightly against her skull, using a piece of string she'd saved from a food parcel. She would recite the Lord's Prayer in Polish, silently moving her lips, the familiar words a comfort even though she had stopped believing in God's mercy months ago. She tried to keep track of the days by scratching marks into the wooden frame of her bunk, but sometimes she forgot, and the count became unreliable. Time had become elastic, stretching and contracting unpredictably. A single day could feel like a week when it was filled with visitors and their demands. But then a week might pass in what felt like a single breath when she retreated so deeply into herself that the external world barely registered. The internal contradictions were the hardest to bear. Marlena hated what she was forced to do, hated the men who used her body as if it were an object, hated the circumstances that had stripped her of agency and choice. But she also felt guilty for sometimes being grateful. Grateful when a visitor was quick and impersonal rather than cruel, grateful for the extra piece of bread that Greta sometimes slipped to her favorites, grateful simply to be alive when so many others in the camp were dying. She tried to show kindness whenever possible, small acts that preserved some sense of her humanity. When Nina had a fever, Marlena had given her own blanket to the younger woman, shivering through the night herself. When Sophia had been beaten by a guard for speaking out of turn, Marlena had helped clean her wounds and had sat with her while she wept. When Inga, the German woman who lived with constant shame for what her countrymen had done, tried to apologize for things that weren't her fault, Marlena had told her firmly, "You are not responsible for the crimes of others. You are only responsible for your own actions." These small kindnesses were rebellion in their own way, proof that the guards and the system hadn't completely destroyed their capacity for compassion. They held secret meetings in the washing room, speaking in whispers about escape, plans that never materialized, about what they would do if they survived, about the lives they hoped to reclaim. Some women dreamed of vengeance, of seeing their captors punished. Others dreamed only of home, of returning to families they prayed were still alive. Marlena's dreams were simpler and more complex at once. She wanted to feel clean again, truly clean, not just the surface washing they were allowed, but a deep cleansing that would reach into her bones and soul. She wanted to sleep through an entire night without nightmares, without waking in a cold sweat from dreams of being chased or trapped or violated in new and terrible ways. She wanted to hear her mother's voice, to eat her mother's cooking, to sit at the kitchen table and talk about ordinary things like the weather and the neighbors and what to plant in the garden this year. But she also feared freedom, feared what would come after if she survived. How would she explain where she had been, what had been done to her, what she had been forced to participate in? Would her family accept her back? Would her village? Or would she be marked forever, tainted by association with the enemy, blamed for her own victimization as women so often were? These thoughts circled endlessly in her mind during the long days of waiting as the sounds of battle grew closer. She tried to distract herself by helping the other women, by organizing the limited supplies they had, by leading group prayers even though her faith was threadbare. Katarzyna taught whoever was interested some basic phrases in Russian, thinking it might be useful if the Soviets arrived first. Hannah led them in singing folk songs, their voices thin and reedy but defiant in the closed confines of Block 7. One afternoon, during what Marlena estimated was the 5th day since Frau Schaefer's announcement, the power went out. The building was plunged into darkness except for the gray winter light filtering through the barred windows. The heating system stopped working, and the temperature dropped rapidly. The women huddled together for warmth, sharing the few blankets they had, their breath visible in the cold air. "They've abandoned us," Nina said quietly, her voice barely audible. "The guards are gone. We're alone." It was true. For hours, they had heard nothing from the corridors. No footsteps, no voices, no sounds of occupation. Marlena and several others had ventured out of the sleeping quarters to explore. The building was eerily silent and empty. Frau Schaefer's office was abandoned, papers scattered across the desk as if she had left in a hurry. The guard station was deserted, rifles gone from their racks, only a few cigarette butts and empty bottles remaining as evidence of their presence. The front door, which had always been locked from the outside, stood slightly ajar. "We could leave," Sophia said, her voice trembling with hope and fear. "We could just walk out." But where would they go? They stood in the doorway, looking out at the camp beyond. The rows of empty barracks, the guard towers unmanned, the gates hanging open. Smoke still rose from the chimney in the distance, though whether anyone remained to tend the furnaces was unclear. The world beyond the wire looked vast and terrifying, full of unknown dangers. "If we leave and the guards come back, they'll shoot us," Inga said. "They said anyone who tried to leave would be shot on sight. But if we stay and the battle reaches the camp, we could be killed in the crossfire," Hannah countered. They argued in circles, unable to reach consensus. Some wanted to risk escape. Others insisted they should wait for liberation. In the end, fear and uncertainty won out. They retreated back into Block 7, closing but not locking the front door, and returned to the sleeping quarters where they waited through another endless night. Marlena lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about choices and consequences. Her whole life had been shaped by other people's choices: the German decision to invade Poland, the officer's decision to raid her village, Frau Schaefer's decision to bring her to Block 7, Weber's decision to request her services. She had been stripped of agency so thoroughly that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to make a real choice, a choice with weight and meaning. But now, lying in the darkness with the door unlocked and the guards gone, she was faced with the most significant choice of her life: stay or go, safety or risk, known horror or unknown possibility. She thought about her father, gunned down in their front yard for the crime of trying to protect his daughter. She thought about her mother's screams, about Pyotr running and falling in the dirt. She thought about the apple orchard and the way the blossoms smelled in spring, the way the fruit tasted when it was perfectly ripe and still warm from the sun. If she stayed here and died, those memories would die with her. No one would remember her father's gentle hands or her mother's strong back or Pyotr's mischievous grin. Her younger sister Zofia, if she was still alive, would never know what had happened to Marlena, would spend her life wondering and imagining scenarios that were probably both better and worse than the truth. But if she tried to leave and was killed, the result would be the same. And if she stayed and survived, she would at least have a chance to return home, to see if anyone was left, to rebuild some fragment of the life that had been taken from her. The questions chased each other through her mind in exhausting circles until dawn broke, gray and cold, bringing with it a sound that made everyone in Block 7 sit upright in terror and hope. The deep rumble of engines, many of them coming closer. Marlena climbed down from her bunk and went to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. Through the bars, she could see movement on the road beyond the camp. Vehicles approaching, not the angular shapes of German trucks and half-tracks, but something different, rounder, with white stars painted on their sides. "They're here," she whispered, her voice catching. "The Americans. They're actually here." The women crowded around the windows, pushing against each other to see. Some were crying, their tears mixing with laughter that sounded hysterical and broken. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing, unable to believe that liberation had actually arrived after so many months of suffering and waiting and dying inside. Marlena felt her knees weaken, felt herself sinking to the floor as the weight of everything, the fear, the pain, the degradation, the desperate hope, crashed over her like a wave. Katarzyna knelt beside her, wrapping her thin arms around Marlena's shoulders, and they held each other as the American tanks rolled through the open gates of the camp, and the war, for them at least, began to end. But even in that moment of release, Marlena felt a strange emptiness, a hollowness where joy should have been. She was free, but who was she now? What was left of the girl who had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, who had loved apple blossoms and her family and the simple rhythms of village life? Freedom, she was beginning to understand, was not an ending. It was just another kind of beginning, and she had no idea how to navigate the world that waited beyond the wire. The first American soldier who entered Block 7 was barely more than a boy, maybe 19 or 20, with freckles across his nose and red hair visible beneath his helmet. He kicked open the door, which had been left unlocked all night, with his rifle raised, clearly expecting resistance or danger. Instead, he found 26 emaciated women in gray dresses staring at him with expressions ranging from terror to desperate hope. He lowered his rifle slowly, his face going pale as he took in the scene before him. The rows of narrow bunks, the thin blankets, the bars on the windows, the smell of unwashed bodies and desperation that hung in the air. His mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. "Jesus Christ," he finally whispered in English, a language most of the women didn't understand but whose tone was universal. "Jesus Christ, what is this place?" He called back through the open door, his voice cracking slightly, and within minutes more soldiers poured into the building. Medics with red crosses on their armbands, officers barking orders, chaplains whose faces crumpled with grief and rage as they understood what they were looking at. The Americans moved through Block 7 with a mixture of efficiency and shock, trying to assess who needed immediate medical attention, trying to communicate across language barriers with women who spoke Polish, Russian, Czech, German, Hungarian, and a dozen other languages but very little English. A medic approached Marlena, a young man with kind brown eyes and gentle hands who spoke slowly in broken German, asking her name, asking if she was injured, asking questions she didn't know how to answer. "How do you explain that your injuries aren't visible? That the real wounds are inside, carved into your psyche and soul?" "Marlena," she managed to say, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My name is Marlena Kowalski, from Poland." The medic wrote this down in a small notebook, his hand shaking slightly. "You're safe now," he said in his careful German. "You're free. No one will hurt you anymore." But Marlena couldn't quite believe it. Freedom seemed like an abstract concept, something that belonged to other people in other places, not to her, not after 8 months of Block 7. She kept expecting guards to appear, for Frau Schaefer to march in and restore order, for the nightmare to reassert itself and prove that this liberation was just another cruel trick. An officer with silver hair and a tired face gathered all the women in the common room. He had an interpreter with him, a soldier who spoke fluent Polish and could translate his words. The officer introduced himself as Major Daniels, said they were from the 5th Armored Division of the United States 3rd Army, said they had been advancing through Germany for weeks and had discovered the camp that morning. "You are under the protection of the United States Army now," Major Daniels said through his interpreter. "We will provide you with medical care, food, clothing, and shelter. When you are strong enough, we will help you return to your homes or find new homes if returning is not possible. You are victims of war crimes, and the men who did this to you will be held accountable." War crimes, victims. The words felt strange and insufficient to describe what had happened in Block 7. Marlena looked around at the faces of the other women. Katarzyna with her hollow cheeks and haunted eyes, Nina who still hadn't spoken a word since the Americans arrived, Hannah who was crying silently, her shoulders shaking, Sophia who sat perfectly still as if carved from stone. They were given their first real meal in days, hot soup, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, along with fresh bread and butter and coffee that smelled like heaven. Marlena ate slowly, her stomach unaccustomed to rich food, tears running down her face as she savored each mouthful. Around her, women were weeping and laughing and talking all at once, a release of emotion that had been bottled up for so long that it erupted like a dam breaking. But the joy was complicated, shadowed by shame and uncertainty. As the initial shock of liberation wore off, reality began to set in. The Americans might have freed their bodies, but they couldn't free them from the memories, from the shame that clung to them like a second skin, from the knowledge of what they had been forced to do and what had been done to them. Over the following days, the women were moved out of Block 7 to a displaced persons camp set up in a nearby town that the Americans had recently captured. They were given clean clothes, civilian dresses donated by aid organizations, too large for their thin frames but clean and whole. They were deloused, examined by doctors who tried to be gentle but whose faces betrayed their horror at the extent of the women's physical and mental trauma. They were assigned to barracks with real beds and heating and windows without bars. But liberation brought its own set of challenges, conflicts that no one had anticipated or prepared for. The first major conflict arose around medical care. Many of the women had been infected with venereal diseases by the men who had used them in Block 7. The American doctors insisted on treating these infections, which required examinations that felt invasive and triggering to women who had spent months being violated. Some women refused treatment entirely, would rather risk death than submit to another examination, another invasion of their bodies even if it was meant to help them. Marlena found herself in the middle of this conflict, trying to mediate between the insistent doctors and the traumatized women. She had learned some English from the American soldiers, picked up enough to communicate basic needs and ideas. She became an informal translator and advocate, explaining to the doctors that they needed to go slower to explain what they. The second conflict was more complex and painful. What to tell the Red Cross workers who were compiling lists of survivors and trying to reunite families. The women of Block 7 faced an impossible choice. Tell the truth about where they had been and risk rejection from their families and communities, or lie and carry the secret forever. Most chose silence. When asked what camp they had been in, they simply said the name of the main camp, omitting any mention of Block 7. When asked what work they had done, they said they had worked in the kitchens or the laundry or the factories, anything but the truth. The shame was too heavy, the fear of judgment too overwhelming. But silence had its own cost. Marlena watched as women who had survived unspeakable horrors together began to drift apart, each retreating into isolation rather than risk others discovering their shared history. The solidarity they had built in Block 7 began to fracture under the weight of shame and the desire to forget. Katarzyna was one of the few who spoke openly about what had happened. "I will not lie," she told Marlena one evening as they sat outside their barracks watching the spring sunset. "I did nothing wrong. I was taken by force, used against my will. The shame belongs to the men who did this, not to me." Her courage inspired some of the others. A small group began meeting in the evenings to talk about their experiences, to process what had happened to them, to try to reclaim their stories from the silence that threatened to swallow them. An American chaplain named Father Murphy, who spoke some Polish, facilitated these meetings when asked, simply listening without judgment as the women poured out their grief and rage and confusion. But these sessions also revealed deep divisions. Some women, like Katarzyna, wanted justice, wanted the officers who had used them identified and prosecuted for war crimes. Others wanted only to forget, to bury the past so deeply that it might eventually feel like it had happened to someone else. A few, like Inga the German woman, struggled with complicated feelings of complicity and guilt despite being victims themselves. "How can I accuse German officers when I am German?" Inga asked during one session, her voice breaking. "Who will believe me? Who will care about what happened to me when my people did so much worse to so many others? You are not responsible for what your countrymen did," Marlena said firmly, reaching across to take Inga's hand. "You were a prisoner just like us. You suffered just like us. Your nationality doesn't change that." But Inga's question haunted Marlena. In the hierarchy of suffering that the war had created, where did the women of Block 7 fit? They were victims, yes, but victims of a particular kind of crime that people didn't want to talk about, that made others uncomfortable, that seemed somehow less serious than other atrocities despite being equally devastating to those who endured it. The third major conflict emerged when the Red Cross finally managed to locate some of the women's families and arranged for reunions. Marlena's sister Zofia had survived, had been found in a displaced persons camp in Austria. The news should have brought joy, but instead Marlena felt overwhelming dread. What would she tell Zofia? Her younger sister had been only 14 when Marlena was taken, still a child in many ways. How could Marlena explain where she had been, What had happened to their parents? What had been done to her? Would Zofia still love her? Would she be disgusted? Would she blame Marlena for surviving when their father and brother had died? The reunion was arranged for a Tuesday morning in early April. Marlena spent the night before unable to sleep, rehearsing different versions of her story, trying to find words that would convey the truth without destroying what remained of her sister's innocence. When Zofia walked into the meeting room, Marlena almost didn't recognize her. Her little sister had grown tall and thin, her face angular and mature beyond her 16 years. But her eyes, those were the same, dark and expressive, flooding with tears the moment she saw Marlena. They ran to each other and held on, both of them crying, neither able to speak for several minutes. Finally, Zofia pulled back and looked at Marlena's face, her hands cupping Marlena's cheeks. "You're alive," Zofia whispered. "I thought. Everyone said you were probably dead, but I knew you were alive. I could feel it." They sat down together, still holding hands, and began the painful process of catching up. Zofia told her story first. How she had hidden in the root cellar when the soldiers came. How she had stayed there for 2 days before emerging to find their father dead in the yard and their mother badly beaten. Their mother had survived for 3 months before dying of her injuries and a broken heart. Zofia had fled the village and spent the last 2 years moving from place to place, doing whatever work she could find, narrowly avoiding capture herself. When it was Marlena's turn, she found the words wouldn't come. She started several times, stumbling over euphemisms and half-truths, unable to speak plainly about Block 7 and what it had been. Zofia waited patiently, and then, with wisdom beyond her years, she said quietly, "You don't have to tell me everything. Not now. Maybe not ever. I know the war did terrible things to people. I know you suffered. That's enough for me to know right now." The relief Marlena felt was overwhelming. She wept again, this time from gratitude that her sister was giving her permission to hold some things private, to reveal her story at her own pace rather than all at once. But as the weeks passed and Marlena and Zofia began planning their return to Poland, Marlena realized that silence would not be sustainable. The trauma of Block 7 was not something she could simply lock away. It lived in her body, in the nightmares that woke her screaming, in the way she flinched when anyone approached her from behind, in her inability to tolerate being touched even in innocent ways. She began attending the evening sessions with Katarzyna and the others more regularly. She started writing down her experiences in a small notebook that Father Murphy had given her, trying to make sense of what had happened by putting it into words. The writing was painful, dragged her back into memories she wanted to forget, but it also helped. Each word she wrote was a small act of defiance, proof that she had survived, that she was still here, still capable of bearing witness. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered and the war in Europe was officially over. The displaced persons camp began the long process of repatriation, sending survivors back to their home countries or helping them emigrate to new ones if return was impossible or unsafe. Marlena and Zofia prepared to return to Poland, though they knew their village had been largely destroyed and that rebuilding would be difficult. They had each other, and for now that felt like enough. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Marlena attended one final meeting with the women from Block 7. Only 12 of them were still at the camp. The others had already been repatriated or had moved to other displaced persons camps. They sat in a circle in a small room, the spring evening light filtering through windows that had no bars, and for the first time, they tried to articulate what Block 7 had meant and what liberation meant. Katarzyna spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I want to remember," she said, "not to torture myself, but because forgetting would mean they won. The men who did this to us wanted us to be silent, to be ashamed, to disappear. I refuse. I will remember, and I will tell my story, and I will make sure the world knows what happened in places like Block 7. Nina, who had finally begun speaking again in recent weeks, said softly, "I want to forget. I want to wake up one day and have it all be gone. Like a bad dream. Maybe that makes me weak, but I can't carry this forever. It's too heavy." "Neither way is wrong," Marlena said, looking around the circle at these women who had become her sisters in suffering. "We each have to find our own path forward. Some of us will speak and some will be silent. Some will seek justice and some will seek peace. There's no right way to survive what we survived. Hannah, who had regained some of her old spirit and had even started singing again, smiled through her tears. I'm going to live, she said. Really live. I'm going to sing and dance and fall in love if I can. I'm going to find joy wherever it exists because they tried to take that from me and I won't let them. Surviving isn't enough. I want to thrive. They talked long into the night, making promises to stay in touch, knowing that most of those promises would likely be broken by time and distance and the difficulty of maintaining connections to people who reminded them of the worst period of their lives. But in that moment, the promises felt real and important. Before they parted, Katarzyna pulled out a piece of paper on which she had written all their names. 26 women were in Block 7 when the Americans came, she said. Some are here tonight, some have already gone. But all of us survived. I'm going to keep this list. I'm going to remember each of you. And someday, when the world is ready to listen, I'm going to tell our story. Marlena took the list and read through the names, each one conjuring a face, a voice, a story. She memorized them, committing them to memory like a prayer or a vow. These women had saved her in ways large and small during the darkest months of her life. She owed them her survival, and she would not let their names be forgotten. The journey back to Poland took 3 weeks, traveling in overcrowded trucks and trains, sleeping in temporary shelters, eating whatever food the Allied relief agencies provided. Marlena and Zofia clung to each other through the chaos, 2 sisters trying to find their way home to a place that no longer existed in the way they remembered it. Their village had been burned during a Soviet advance. The apple orchard was gone, the trees cut down for firewood or killed by fire. The house where they had grown up was a pile of rubble. Their father's grave, which Zofia had marked with a wooden cross before fleeing, had been disturbed, the cross broken and lying in the dirt. They stood together in what had once been their front yard, looking at the destruction, and Marlena felt something inside her break and reform simultaneously. This was not the homecoming she had dreamed of during her months in Block 7. There would be no return to the life she had known before. That life was gone, as surely as if it had never existed. But standing there with her sister's hand in hers, feeling the May sun warm on her face and hearing the birds singing in the few trees that remained, Marlena realized something important. She was still alive. Despite everything, the violence, the degradation, the loss of nearly everyone she loved, she had survived. And survival, she was beginning to understand, was not an ending but a beginning. We'll rebuild, Zofia said softly, as if reading Marlena's thoughts. Not the same house, not the same life, but something new, something ours. Marlena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought of Katarzyna and her vow to remember, of Hannah's determination to find joy, of Nina's need to forget. She thought of all the women from Block 7, scattered now across Europe, each trying to find her own way forward through the wreckage of war. And she thought of herself, of the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. She had lost so much, her innocence, her family, her sense of safety in the world. But she had also gained something unexpected. A deep understanding of her own strength, a connection to other women who had endured the unendurable, and a fierce determination to build a life that would honor both her suffering and her survival. In the months and years that followed, Marlena and Zofia rebuilt a small cottage on the edge of their old property. Marlena never returned to her dream of becoming a nurse. The idea of working in a medical setting triggered too many traumatic memories. Instead, she learned midwifery from an older woman in a neighboring village, finding purpose in helping bring new life into the world, in supporting other women through their own painful but natural transformations. She never married. The intimacy that marriage would require felt impossible, too fraught with memories of Block 7. But she built a full life nonetheless, surrounded herself with women friends who became her chosen family, threw herself into her work with a dedication that gave her days meaning and structure. She rarely spoke of Block 7, even with Zofia. The silence was not born of shame. Katarzyna had taught her that the shame belonged to the perpetrators, not the victims, but of a desire to live in the present rather than the past. The memories were always there, surfacing in nightmares and triggered by unexpected moments. But she learned to carry them without letting them define her entirely. 30 years after liberation, Marlena received a letter from Katarzyna. The older woman had become a teacher again, had written a memoir about her experiences during the war, including her time in Block 7, and wanted Marlena's permission to use her real name in the book. Marlena held the letter for a long time, reading and rereading it, remembering the woman who had been her anchor in the darkest time of her life. Katarzyna had kept her promise to remember, to tell their story, to ensure the world knew what had happened in places like Block 7. Marlena wrote back, giving her permission and her blessing. "Tell it all," she wrote. "Tell the truth. The world needs to know what war does to women, how we are used as weapons against our own people, how our bodies become battlefields. Tell it so that maybe someday it will stop happening." She never read Katarzyna's book. She didn't need to. She had lived it, had survived it, had spent 3 decades learning to live with it. That was enough. On her 65th birthday, Marlena planted an apple tree in her garden, a descendant of the trees from her father's orchard, propagated from rootstock that had survived the fire. She stood back and looked at the small sapling, its branches bare in the late autumn chill, and thought about cycles, of destruction and growth, of death and rebirth, of trauma and healing. The tree would take years to bear fruit, might not produce a single apple in her lifetime. But she planted it anyway, an act of faith in a future she might not see, a gesture of hope that life could regenerate even from the deepest devastation. That night, she dreamed of Block 7 for the first time in months. But this time, when she woke, she didn't feel the usual panic and despair. Instead, she felt something closer to peace. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but a gentle acceptance that she had survived the unsurvivable, that she had built a life worth living despite everything, that she was more than the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She rose with the dawn, made herself tea, and stood at her window watching the sun rise over the fields. Somewhere across Europe, other women from Block 7 were waking to their own mornings, carrying their own memories, living their own hard-won lives. They were connected still, bound by shared trauma and shared survival, even if they never spoke to each other again. Marlena raised her teacup in a silent toast to them all, to Katarzyna who remembered, to Nina who tried to forget, to Hannah who chose joy, to all 26 women who had walked out of Block 7 into an uncertain freedom. They had survived. And survival, she had finally learned, was not nothing. It was everything. The apple tree would grow. Spring would come again. Life would continue. And she would be there to witness it. A woman who had been broken but not destroyed, who had been used but never truly conquered, who had emerged from the darkness carrying both scars and strength in equal measure. This was not the ending she had imagined as a young girl in her father's orchard, dreaming of becoming a nurse and helping others. But it was an ending and a beginning she could live with, and in the end that was enough. Thank you for listening to this powerful story about survival, resilience, and the hidden histories of women during World War II. The experiences of women like Marlena, forced into sexual slavery in Nazi camp brothels, remain one of the lesser-known atrocities of the war, their stories often buried beneath shame and silence for decades. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you ensure you won't miss future episodes exploring untold histories, marginalized voices, and the complex human experiences that shaped our world. Each story we tell helps preserve memories that might otherwise be forgotten and honors the strength of those who survived unimaginable circumstances.